Melton Coldfield to interview Nick Sellman, who started off doing HMOs about 15 years ago, and now he's built a multi-million pound property investing business alongside a healthcare business. A very inspirational guy. Watch the interview because he's going to share loads of fantastic information and insights. Thank you for obviously agreeing to do this interview. Just for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, what do you do? In a nutshell.
As a business?
Yes.
We own a property-based entity that specialises in real estate development and investments. It operates across 3 different sectors, specialising in PRS schemes, which are what we call private sector blocks of apartments for rent to young professional tenants generally. Student housing, which is purpose-built or custom-made housing for the student sector, and we build a portfolio of care schemes, which are healthcare sites centred around the provision of care for nursing and dementia.
So plenty of stuff going on for you then, obviously. And how did you get into the world of property? Where did it all start?
I initially started investing in property just as a part of my personal pension. And then some of the techniques that I employed in the early days, very similar to what we continue to do as a business now, but it grew really from a point of creating a buy-to-let portfolio to the state that we're currently in.
And throughout that time, obviously, you've done lots of stuff which we're going to go into.
Yes.
But what's the biggest mistake you've made, and what did you learn from it?
Probably make thousands of mistakes, and we still make them every day. But I think the key to the growth of our business is to not be too scared of making those mistakes and see them. We've always seen them as a benefit to the group. So we try a lot of new things. We engage in new processes, introduce new systems to the business, employ new members of staff, and some of those processes will work and make us operate more efficiently, and some of them won't and will need to be tweaked and reviewed. But I think the key to the growth of what we've always done is to embrace change, to introduce new methods within the business, and the ones that don't work to learn from and then to expand upon them moving forwards. So we've made thousands of them, is the answer to your question, but all for a good reason.
Just like everybody else.
Yeah.
And I'm the same. And how many people do you employ in your business right now?
Not a great deal. So the growth of what we've done from its inception has always been based upon the philosophy of subcontracting out services to third-party companies within our group. And the benefit of that to us is that it protects us in the regard that not only are those companies that we're outsourcing to much bigger than ours and have vast experience within their respective industries, but they also carry public indemnity insurance policies, which means that if there are any issues, we're always covered by the fact that we're insured against them. So when we engage in a development process, for example, we outsource the management of that through to a third-party development manager, which will employ a quantity surveyor, structural engineer, mechanical electrical design contractor underneath them, and that means that we get a suite of subcontractors working for us that are all fully insurance-backed.
I think that's a smart way of doing things, because obviously right now you've got outsourcing, subcontractors, freelancing.
Yeah.
And so I think you've got a very agile way of working, which is good. So was that on purpose or was that by chance?
Yeah, it was on purpose, and I think one of the hardest things to do in business is to employ people. The human factor of things is where complications come from generally, but we have a very strong core group of competent individuals that are very, very good at what they do. So we have probably an employee team of somewhere between 12 and 15 full-time members of staff, but they will oversee a number of outsourced entities on behalf of our business.
And how do you manage all this? Because there's lots going on for you, and obviously you're a busy entrepreneur, I assume you've got a family. And how do you balance everything?
I balance it by working alongside very talented people. So I've always tried to ensure, since we've been of a sufficient size, that the people that I employ or that we work alongside are better than I am in their respective roles. So I can take comfort from the fact that you've got very experienced members of your team or your resource around you that you can lean upon in times when you've got a lot of work flow.
A lot of people watching this interview are going to be property investors or entrepreneurs. And one of the biggest challenges they face, Nick, is delegating. Because in their own mind, they think nobody can do the job as well as they can.
Yeah.
Or if they let somebody else do the job, it's going to take longer. Did you have that challenge when you started off?
A little bit. I was very lucky in the fact that I'm not a very talented handyman, so I can't even change a plug at home. So I've always had to outsource the sort of construction elements of what we did in the early days when we were refurbishing basic houses. But I think it's a mindset thing in that regard. And yes, there is an element of I trust myself. I will make sure I can get that task done. But at the same time, you will always have a ceiling to how far you can take your property journey if you are limited by that sort of outlook, really.
Yeah, so basically if people want to grow, then they need to learn to delegate and have people who are better than them at certain tasks.
Yes, well, at a certain level. There's a point in time where you will physically have enough time to be able to do everything, but it depends how your ambitions, and if you have an intention to grow a portfolio of properties, you can't be all things to all people, and you cannot be everywhere at once. So you have to trust and work alongside people that can assist you, and the easiest way and the most cost-effective way to do that is to start by subcontracting that out to other companies that have resource within their business that will provide a service to you. And we've just evolved that philosophy on a larger scale to where we are today.
And I think that works really well, because I've seen a lot of smaller businesses use that particular philosophy to a great extent, and I think it's a fantastic business model, by the way. So I think you're doing some good stuff there. And you and I met a few weeks ago at Echo Point, and that's a very interesting project. Give us a bit of background how that started.
Going back to sort of the early 2010s, we've always engaged in a lot of what we call regeneration projects, or the amendment of existing buildings to different use classifications. And we've built a business around that over the preceding 10 years. It's becoming more and more difficult to do that on scale. So the development you're referring to is a two-stage development of 380 apartments in Birmingham. And we'll generally do several of those on an annual year basis, but it's the recent changes in planning legislation that we initially took advantage of in 2013 were based upon permitted development rights, and that enables you to change office blocks to residential accommodation with a very limited oversight from planning. Now the amendments that have come in August of this year mean that it's no longer possible to do large scale developments under that piece of legislation, but from a smaller scale development perspective, you can still reconfigure those buildings up to, I think, 14 or 15,000 square feet.
That's right.
So whereas we've sort of grown to a scale that's probably too small of a development for us to be engaging in anymore, it's still a great strategy for more agile or smaller based development companies to be taking part in.
So what kind of impact is that going to have on your business going forward?
Not much, if I'm being honest, because we were aware that what's happened over the last, say, 24 to 36 months is there are a lot more companies or property-based investors in the UK that were turned on to the fact that there was value in converting offices to residential. So we've really sort of moved away from that strategy a number of years ago anyway, because it's driven up the value of bricks and mortar, and what an intrinsic office development value would have been 5 years ago is very different to what it is today. So we're always looking for the next strategy that most people aren't partaking in, and that's why we're doing a lot of healthcare development as we speak at the current time.
Which is obviously big, and there's a huge demand for that, obviously, and with an ageing population.
Yeah,
I think that's a good strategy to adopt. Now, in your business, I'm sure you've learned loads of things over the years. What's the one thing that you learned that you think everybody ought to know about?
The one thing I've learned?
Yeah.
I've learned
I know there's loads, but one that you think that was really useful, and if everybody knew this, it would possibly help them in their business.
I think don't be too well, if I'm giving somebody advice, if that's what you mean.
That's right.
I think to scale, you need to understand the structure and process of third-party debt within your business or within your property portfolio. Everything is based on leverage, but it has to be sensible leverage at a sensible level. And the management of loan agreements that you're partaking with your banks is not something you should be scared of. Go and borrow money is what I'm saying, but it just needs to be done in a managed way. So you need the right professional team around you to advise you as to how to go about that. But you won't be able to engage in real estate in any way, shape or form unless you're introducing third-party debt within your group. And it starts with a buy-to-let mortgage if you're just buying one apartment or one house, and it can transpire into large-scale development facilities thereafter, if that's the journey that you want to enter into.
Yeah, and that's a good thing as long as you're sensible about it and you manage it well and you understand the role and responsibility.
You have to know your
obligations.
numbers. And we're fortunate enough now to employ a lot of competent financial professionals within our business that can assist me making those types of day-to-day decisions. But to begin with, all you need is a good mortgage broker.
So when you're starting out projects, do you go to banks for the funding, or do you go to individual investors and get them involved in your projects?
Initially, I worked with a lot of high net worth investors, and they would introduce capital into our projects. And then off the back of that, we would then entertain a development agreement with a bank that would provide senior debt facility for us to be able to build out or pay our contractors. And we still work in a very similar way now. However, we have slightly more sophisticated debt structures within the group for some of our larger schemes.
So let's say if somebody's got £20,000 that they want to invest and they're not keen to do a project themselves,
yes,
can they invest those funds with you?
We do work with high net worths and sophisticated individuals on a basis akin to that, but we have a minimum investment level of 50,000.
So if they've got 50,000 or more, they could contact you and then you'll talk to them about how the whole thing works.
Correct, yeah. And then our responsibility and our experience in overseeing those developments can be put to sort of greater work for it, I suppose.
Talking a bit more about your business, do you have a mentor, or have you ever had a mentor?
I've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of experienced property individuals within the industry over the last 10 years. I wouldn't say I've necessarily always had a mentor, but because I've done a lot of joint ventures, I've been able to sort of leverage on the experience and skill sets of other people within the real estate industry. But a lot of what we've done over the years is by as I mentioned, we have a very outsourced philosophy within the group, but that's enabled us to work alongside some very experienced companies that have been able to introduce some of their experience and some of their previous mistakes to ensure that we don't make them.
Which is helpful, isn't it? Really, yeah. And obviously part of scaling up and growing your business, there's obviously personal growth as well. So do you read books, listen to podcasts, watch YouTube videos, do training and that stuff?
Yeah. Training, there's a when you sort of get to the level that we're working at now, there's a very limited amount of training within real estate in across the world, in my opinion. But yeah, you should be constantly trying to educate yourself. You should be reading as many books and listening to as many podcasts as you physically can. I listen to a podcast every morning in the gym, for example, and I just think that continual growth will continue throughout my
Any particular podcast you listen to which you would recommend to others?
I listen to the Diary of the CEO. That's quite an interesting one from a business perspective. Various business related ones. What's another one that I listen to? High Performance Podcast is quite good.
Yeah.
Not listened to any of yours though so far, but I will.
I'll have to send them. And in terms of books, what are the kind of top 3 books that stand out for you that you think everybody ought to at least look at, if not fully read?
That's very, very personal. I mean, not personal as in my answer, but it's very it's down to people's interpretation of what they're trying to achieve.
People are always asking me for book recommendations.
Yeah.
I've given them all the ones that I've got, by the way.
And if I'm being honest, I've got 2 young children now. I don't really get a lot of time to read books, so I do listen to a lot of audio books, and I probably might listen to 50 or 60 a year. So to pick 1 or 2 out, it's quite tough. But I listen to a lot of autobiographies.
Yeah.
A lot of self-development books. A lot of sort of business strategy. One of my big things at the moment is about neuro-linguistic programming.
Yeah,
so fantastic. I try and develop my subconscious and how the brain works. So I'm quite intrigued by that type of thing as well. And you can deploy that into everyday life with everyday stresses and situations that you'll find yourself within work and in
I think it helps you to communicate better with people, understand them better. So it's a big thing. Linked with that, has Tony Robbins had any influence? Because I know he's bigger on NLP. Yeah,
I've read one of Tony's books, but I can't say I've gone into too much detail.
Some do and some don't. So for anybody who's starting out new as a property investor, or perhaps has a full-time job looking to go into property, what advice would you give them? I know it's general, but because sometimes people are scared to make that move, but they want to make the move.
Somebody quite experienced once told me that if you have a job and you want to get into real estate, don't leave your job. And that's exactly what I did, and it still holds true today. You don't need to be doing property full time to earn revenue or an income from it, and it can be a hobby to start with. And I would suggest that in your spare time, when I first started, I managed to build a portfolio just by getting out of bed 1 hour early in the morning, doing an hour's work, and going to bed 1 hour later on an evening, doing an hour's work. I still managed to hold down a full-time job, and I still managed to have quite significant results within a year off the back of it. And I would still suggest that should be the case. Treat it as a hobby to begin with, educate yourself in your spare time, and then see whether or not the process that you've engaged in is something that's attractive enough to you for you want to do it as a job, because it's not for everyone, but it should provide you with a supplementary form of income, at least in the short term, which will mean that you can make that decision in the future.
On that note, I'm quite interested in local politics. I'm a councillor in Peterborough, and something we always talk about is the housing crisis. So I'm interested to hear your view on how, if you were the Prime Minister, how would you solve the housing crisis in this country?
I personally, because I'm doing this day to day, I don't think there would be a housing crisis in this country if the planning system was reformed. If anything, COVID has taught us significantly in the last 18 months that we work within a planning system which is heavily dictated by local authorities. Local authorities are quite large organisations now, which are, on the scheme of things, significantly underfunded, but the levels of resource that they have aren't necessarily reflective within the planning system. So the development within the UK is primarily privately focused. So you've got companies that are working with local authority to process planning applications. Because they are under-resourced, the time it's taken to process applications has probably tripled. Yeah. The planning decisions that you're receiving are not only slow to come through, but slightly ambiguous in terms of their interpretation of legislation. So sometimes you're getting results that aren't necessarily reflective of what legislation should be teaching you. In my opinion, if we could find a number of years ago, the building regulations industry within this country was privatised. So now, if you want to go and put an extension on the back of your house, you can employ a local authority building controller, but you can employ a private company. That's massively sped up the process in terms of how you're contracting on site.
Building control as well, yeah.
If that was privatised in a similar vein within the planning system, I'm pretty sure that we'd see a massive change within the number of housing units being delivered. And I just think we need to address the way that those private companies could then decide upon planning legislation, but it's an inefficiency in the system that is absolutely astronomical. I don't think in the short term it's going to be able to. We've got a solution for it.
Yeah, because I think it's difficult because obviously local authorities are under-resourced.
Yeah.
So finding more personnel to manage the planning applications is a huge challenge right now, and I'm seeing that obviously in Peterborough as a councillor, but obviously up and down the country. Yes. And I'm talking to other people as well.
The thing to consider, which is frustrating for a lot of developers, that yes, we agree that with an under-resource, there's an under-skilling in the sector as well, in terms of planners coming through the education system. But at the same time, developers are charged a significant sum of money to process a planning application, and that's not always reflected in the service that you're receiving from the local authority as a consequence. So that's just a little bit of a juxtaposition that we face within our industry at the moment.
And what do you think the world of property will look like in 5 years' time based on everything you know?
I think we've gone through a historic process of interest rates being low, and I don't think that can stay forever. I think there needs to be an alteration in people's mind. There's been a dramatic shift in the last 10 years of a buy-to-let culture in the UK, which has then almost been stifled by government legislation, which has made it, through taxation, slightly less attractive for the everyman to be holding 2 or 3 buy-to-lets within their portfolio. So what we've seen is quite a significant shift now in terms of legislation as to the government really want to see larger scale, more professional landlords that not only look after their tenants but provide a level of accommodation with their buildings which is slightly more professional than the everyman would who's owning just one additional property. So I think that's a significant consideration, and I think that will continue to happen. I think within the healthcare sector, it's full of very specific legislation to protect not only the users but also how people are cared for within their property. So there's a lot of barriers to entry within that. we've spent a lot of time putting together an experienced and very skilled a team of staff that can administer and provide a level of care within both nursing and the dementia sector. And the reason that we've done that is I can see a continued shift of undersupply within the nursing sector within this country. So we've almost gone in that direction as a way of filling that void, really. But I just think we'll continue, as long as planning is where it is, we'll continue to see an undersupply of housing against the needs of the population. What you are seeing in the debt market specifically is a lot of a new generation of banks and funding entities that are slightly more entrepreneurial than the high street have traditionally been.
And a bit more flexible.
Yeah, and that is a massive positive for the property industry, and hopefully that will continue to be the case as well. But I do think as we continue in the next 2 years specifically, we're going to have a few more challenges within the construction sector, because there are a lot of pressures being put on third-party contractors and subcontractors that are beyond their own control, which are dictating a growth in construction prices currently. So how that transforms into 2022 remains to be seen, but I can see an increase in costs all around in line with the inflation that we're experiencing at the moment.
That plus obviously there's a lot of pressure on the supply chain, so things are taking a lot longer to come through.
To a degree, yeah.
So do you think that's going to get easier next year, or do you think that's going to...
I think so. I think some of that has been prompted by Brexit as well. And obviously, if you went to a builder's merchants, they might be receiving supplies from Eastern Europe and Western Europe, which now they're not necessarily got access to on the same level. So in the background, over the last 18 months, you'll see a lot of new trade relationships have been slowly formed. You can now buy goods from places like Canada and America that would have previously come from places like China and Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
So it will come around. We're quite an entrepreneurial nation, aren't we?
Of course we are.
And the problem will be solved. It was just take a little bit of time to bed in.
Yeah. So if you could have tea, coffee or a beer with any historical figure, who would it be and why?
Historical figure?
Yeah.
Wow. Apart from you mean, Shaz?
I'm ancient.
You should have asked me these questions before. I'm unprepared.
Yeah.
I don't know. When I was a kid, I did a degree in politics, and our glorious leader Boris Johnson, most people don't know, he's actually related to Winston Churchill. He's a bit of an inspirational character, isn't he? So I'd imagine he'd be a bit of a character. In his spare time, I think he used to like building brick walls, which is a bit of an odd pastime for a politician, but I think he might be an interesting guy for a glass of stout or a beer.
And if you did that, what one question do you think you might ask him?
My job is quite high pressure, and I think when reading what little bits I have and watching films about some of his life experiences, he suffered from depression at stages where it probably wasn't an open conversation. Back in the 40s and 50s, a man wasn't supposed to be experiencing the lows and the darkness that he went through. He used to call it the black dog, and but he managed to see us through a war. He went through 3 different elections, and it's quite an inspirational way of tackling problems in an era where there wasn't necessarily the same level of advice that we have now.
Support, yeah.
So going back to sort of discussions about NLP and mental strength, I'd probably ask him how he copes with going through the pressures that he did with the weight of a nation on his shoulders.
You probably know the answer to that as well, by the way, but we won't talk about that. What do you do when you're not working in terms of spending time with the family or relaxing or hobby-wise?
Yeah.
If you have any, if you have time for
well, I don't have time for hobbies at the moment, unfortunately, but I do, as I mentioned, I've got a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. And whereas I give my sort of working week to the business to make sure that our processes continue to be as efficient as they can, on the weekends I just try and spend as much time at home with the family and my children, especially while they're young, because it goes in a blink, really.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I spend half of my life at dance classes, Shaz, and the latest one is skiing on a Sunday, skiing lessons in the freezing cold. But yeah, it's all good fun.
That's what I do. I'm a part-time taxi driver on the weekends, taking my kids here, there and everywhere.
Yeah.
Now obviously you've got a sizable business.
Yeah.
But people with a smaller business have similar challenges but on a different level. So if you had only 10% of the budget you've got right now, how would you think you'd run your property business differently?
I wouldn't. And like a lot of the strategies I used at the start and the systems that I used at the start are very similar to what we have now. The only difference is I now have the luxury of being able to employ more competent people, but we've just taken those principles and scaled them. So the idea of outsourcing, because you couldn't afford staff, that still applies now, but we can afford staff. We just choose to operate slightly more efficiently and work with subcontract companies rather than employing individuals. My investment philosophy is exactly the same as the first day I invested in property. So we would buy something very well, either off market or through friendly local agents that you build relationships with who give you multiple schemes. We add some value to it through planning and change of use, add some more value to it through redevelopment, and the intrinsic equity that you've created in those three processes is enough for you to be able to refinance that property, hold it for the long term, and then put it into your portfolio. So you could do that with one apartment, you could do that with 100 apartments, you could do it with one student accommodation block, you can do it with 100 nursing homes. It's just the same process.
That's good advice. Now, obviously you're a busy guy and time management is a big challenge for all of us. How do you manage your time to make sure you're as productive as you can be?
That's a trick for anyone, and there's no answer to that, if I'm being honest with you. You have to sort of make best use of the decisions that you make with your time, who you spend it with, because some people will suck time out of you, how you spend it and where you spend it. We're quite fortunate enough to have offices now, so I can outsource a lot of my day-to-day responsibility to members of our team. So I think the key to growing a larger scale business is to make sure you don't have a job. So part of my job is to outsource my responsibilities to others. And if I'm generally busy, it means I'm not doing something correctly within that process. But at the same time, I don't think there is a good or bad use of your time. It's also a case of how do you want to use your time. So you should always be doing something that you love and it doesn't feel like a chore as a result of that. So it's not necessarily a job, it's a vocation then.
That's a good way of seeing it. Now I know, Nick, you're only 21, but if you were to go back to your 18-year-old self, what one bit of advice would you give an 18-year-old Nick?
Take your time, probably. I've always been fiercely ambitious as a youth, and I feel like I lost my 20s trying to achieve something that would have come anyway. But if you live in the moment a little bit and stop worrying about the future and what's happened in the past, I'm a big advocate of that nowadays.
Drop that baggage and move on.
Yeah, but also take your time to make decisions and consider. If you don't sit down and let the world revolve around you and have a think, sometimes the answers will come to you without you having to toil away to try and find them. So it's almost to be a little bit more considered and respectful of yourself. So there's only one you, you've only got one life, but enjoy the moment that you're in.
And be good to yourself.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And what's the one question that I should have asked you that I haven't asked you that you think I should ask?
One question?
Yeah.
I'm not too sure. I mean, I'm asked 1,000 questions a day, really, but maybe what's important to me.
What's important to you then, Nick?
And I think you, when you're getting out of bed, this is a business discussion now, but you have to understand why you are getting out of bed in the morning, because you're putting yourself through a lot of unneeded pressure in a lot of instances, trying to achieve what we have so far within our business. And there's got to be a reason. If you haven't got a good enough reason, you'll never get to where you're trying to get to as a goal. So, I mean, initially I started investing in property to look after my family, and I've been able to do that a little bit now. So a lot of our family members will actually engage within the business. As we've grown, we've been able to bring people with us along the journey, which is quite a nice thing to see. But at the same time, I do sort of appreciate I'm trying to create a long-term a stable platform for my family to be able to evolve in the future. And whereas I started this as somebody single, unmarried, I've now ended up with a wife and children, and you take this start 10 years down the road and you can really see the positive effects that some of the decisions that I made in my 30s have ended up now. I'm an old codger at 40 years old. So it's good, but at the same time, it's been a very interesting journey. And the key thing that I can take from what we've seen so far is that we've tried to learn from every stage that we've gone through as part of the process.
Good. It's been an absolute pleasure. Nick.
Thank you for coming, Shaz. Appreciate it.
Thank you.